This is Theater Talk. I'm Susan Haskins. Here with me is my co-host, Michael Riedel of the New York Daily News.
Many drama critics consider the book to 1776 to be the best ever written for a musical. I'm sure our guest tonight would agree since he wrote it. He is, of course, Peter Stone, whose other musicals include Titanic, now a big success on Broadway, My One and Only, and The Will Rogers Follies. Peter, an old friend of ours, a frequent guest on this show, welcome.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Peter, 1776 is a big hit at the Roundabout Theater. Ends its run November 16th, I believe. There's been a lot of talk in the press, including my column in the Daily News, about it moving to the Gershwin Theater. As of our taping here in early October, the future of the show moving to Broadway seems to be in doubt. Can you tell us at this point what's going on and what you think will happen?
Well, it's a very difficult move when you move from a 500-seat house with the labor contracts that exist for actors, musicians, stagehands, and the rest of it, and the necessary things that you have to have, to a very large house. One of our problems is that the only house really available to us is the largest house on Broadway. So we'll be moving from what is in effect the smallest house, Broadway house, to the largest.
The Gershwin with 1,900 seats or something.
Yes. Wow. There have been compensations made for that, and our designer, Tony Walton, has made certain compensations which are really quite attractive. But there are enormous problems, and it's just not sure yet. We're hoping that it does, since if it does, it would be a very large hit. But it does, I mean, it always has been.
Sure. Right.
It never hasn't been, to use a double negative. First time it ran for over 1,400 performances, which was in those days practically unheard of. Mm-hmm. It ran on the road. The first company ran for over 2 years. The second company ran for a year. It won the awards in London. It's been always successful.
And the movie's always been popular. I mean, it's aired frequently. Can you go into, with any detail, some of the specific problems involved in the transfer of this show?
Well,
I know I had reported about actors want more money because at the Roundabout it's nonprofit, so they want a higher salary, and musicians seem to want more money or.
Well, but the actors, they're entitled to more money. They've worked for very little, and those are all of them. It's one of the most spectacularly good companies I've ever worked with. They're wonderful.
And you have a TV star in there. Is he more expensive?
Yes. No, not yet.
Give him time.
No. By that, we can't possibly. Not just TV. He's in the feature.
Brent Spiner, right?
Brent Spiner of Star Trek, and the amount of money he's getting for that, I won't reveal it because my mouth as a theater person doesn't form those kinds of figures yet. I haven't learned. I get over 47.95 and I run into trouble. But I tell you, there's 7 numbers there, but they've been working at very, very close to minimum over there at the Roundabout, and they're entitled to it. They really have, and they should have it. Musicians, it's not about money per se. That's an expression I don't think I've ever used. Let me say it again, just to make sure. Per se, it's not about money. Right. It's about the number of musicians you have, regardless of how many you need.
Right.
The Musicians Union seems to feel that you should have a large number, even if many of them are playing not instruments but cards.
You could pull the old David Merrick trick and make them play the violin in the ladies' and men's lounges in the theater.
You know, you can have, when we did Will Rogers Follies, the pit was reduced in size because we had that, what they call a passerelle, the walk around out over the audience. And they reduced the pit in size quite a bit, and the string section, the entire string section, was on the 8th floor of the hotel next door. I'm not joking. Watching the conductor on television, sitting in their underwear, reading magazines and playing the string section. Nobody ever knew. They were in the 8th floor up above in the hotel.
But always there to collect their checks every week.
Well, they played. They were in the show. They did play. I mean, they were heard.
So you just don't need all those musicians, but you may.
Well, we don't need them for one reason. Our orchestration, we used 8 at Roundabout. Our Paul Gemignani, our resident conductor and musical genius, has upped it to about 16 top, and he really only needs 12 at 16, but they want a good number more than that.
Okay, so the upshot, since we are taping, let's stress before the decision is made, we are not really sure if the move is going to happen right at this point. All right.
No.
Peter, these are really the Peter Stone days on Broadway. I mean, you have as many shows as Andrew Lloyd Webber with 1776 and Titanic. I know you had a lot of success in the past, but I mean, do you feel that you are now in your halcyon days as a Broadway writer? And
Or as I heard someone say the other day on television, my Helicon days. Well, it's a good time. I mean, these are both shows. It was my first Tony and my last Tony, and
you won the Tony for book for Titanic, and
and on 1776, both shows won Best Show. Both, you know, they're both quite. They have similarities. They're both historically based, dealing with fact in the musical. In a musical style, a musical genre, but it's the first show I've done since, well, Will Rogers had a bit of it. The Life of Will Rogers, that dealt a good deal with fact as well, but not to the extent. That one was tricked up to be a Ziegfeld show. It was his life as Ziegfeld would have done it.
Right.
You know, this is the Titanic as it happened, and the signing of the Declaration as it happened. The facts of 1776 are very, very strongly based in this show. There's very little
poetic
straying.
license. Or?
Yeah, there's a good deal of poetic license, but not with the facts.
We should say, for those who haven't seen it, the protagonist of 1776 is John Adams.
And Franklin and Jefferson.
But everybody dislikes John Adams, which apparently was true.
Well, dislikes him personally. The expression at the time that he was obnoxious and disliked, but they respected him. Interestingly, or not, depending, you'll be the judge of that, Richard Nixon admired John Adams more than anybody else because after the war was won, or during the period when the war was going on, there was the thing called the Boston Massacre, where British soldiers fired into a crowd of Americans. They killed 5. It was still called a massacre. Kent State was 4. They didn't call it a massacre because we'd run out of. By then, hyperbole was changed. And the soldiers were arrested and tried, and they were terrible. They were almost lynched. And John Adams went in and defended them under the principle that everybody is entitled to a spirited defense. And even Richard Nixon. So I think that's why he admired him more than anybody else.
Also, though, I think Adams, at least in your interpretation of him, is extremely bright, but also dark and brooding and prickly. A little bit, I think, quite a bit like Nixon was.
Well, there are great differences.
Yeah.
Adams was a scrupulously legitimate man. I mean, he was scrupulously
didn't have a tape recorder around either.
Honest is the word I don't like to use, but it was. But he certainly was. His integrity was beyond question, and. But Adams was a driving force. His energy was a driving force. Certainly Franklin's authority, because he was the oldest man but one in the Congress. He was an accomplished man. And he was a venerable character, and he had a great deal of influence.
And popular author, Benjamin Franklin.
Yes. And a printer, and many other. It's remarkable is that all these men had many professions. And there was the young Jefferson, still untried, who, as Adams himself says, they made him write it because he wrote 10 times better than any man in Congress, including Adams, as Adams said.
Right.
He had a happy talent for composition, and he was a very graceful man with a pen. But he's also an architect. He was also a great.
A bon vivant with the slaves.
Well, that was later in his
Not
life.
in there, right?
Not at this point.
No.
But it is a show also about the molding of a writer, about Jefferson emerging as this articulate
as a kind of writer,
spokesperson.
yes. And but it's really about the problems of getting the country started, which somehow those problems they're not taught. It was a great puzzlement to me for a long time why they're not taught, why they weren't taught. I was a pretty good history student in all through high school and college. I didn't know a lot about it, and it's our national myth. I mean, it's our national legend. I didn't know a great deal about it. I knew that they had cardboardized all of these characters, and they weren't human.
No,
they were mythic, and that part. But I also knew about 5 names who had signed, I knew Hancock because it was that large
The big one,
signature, right? And I knew Button Gwinnett somehow because it was the rarest one at the autograph houses because he'd only signed one other thing in his life. But I didn't know who anybody else was. I didn't know what was going on at the time. I didn't realize that the country was, in a sense, divided in 3 separate and different sections. That the colonies, the 4 New England colonies were very, very political and very even radical. The 4 Middle Atlantic colonies were very, very conservative and business-like. They handled the mercantile and,
Right.
You certainly showed that the forces of conservatism have not changed.
No. Well, there's an interesting story about that. But also the 4 southern colonies were agrarian and slaveholders.
Yeah.
It was their peculiar institution, as they called it. Only Virginia stood apart as the nobility of the colonies. And whenever you wanted to do anything that would get the other colonies to agree, you always got a Virginian to do it. To lead the army, you got Washington. To propose independence, you got Richard Henry Lee. To write the Declaration, you got Jefferson, and so forth. And
Because they were the only ones people would go along with?
they had a kind of standing, a kind of respect. The whole colony was or aristocracy of the colonies and of the other colonies. And but if you want to accomplish something, Patrick Henry, and so forth, you got one of them. But you mentioned the Eastern, the Atlantic, Middle Atlantic colonies. 1776 played the Nixon White House back in 1970, I think. And later, when Jack Warner, who was the head of the Warner Brothers, made the film, it wasn't made. He didn't make it at Warner Brothers, but he had left Warner Brothers, but he was one of the original founding members, and he produced this film. He never produced anything else in his life as a hands-on producer. He'd just been a studio head. Nixon called him. Now, Nixon and he had a relationship dating back to the beginning of the blacklist, when all the studio heads all caved in because they didn't want trouble. And they had a bit of a relationship, and Nixon told him to cut out the conservative number. The men
to the right, always to the right, never to the left.
It was a minuet danced by the...
Very powerful number.
Very powerful number. And Nixon asked him to cut it out, and he did cut it out. And to make certain it was out, he burnt the negative. And the film was released without it, to its detriment. However, later, when they went to do the Laserdisc, the people who did the disc went on searching for it and found a positive, not a negative, in the film vaults, in the salt caverns of Utah or Colorado, wherever they're kept, and actually found a positive of it and inserted it in the, and now it's back in the video cassette.
Well, now let's take a look at them doing this. It's the cool, considerate men at the roundabout.
Yes.
Come ye cool, considerate set. We'll dance together to the same minuet. To the right, ever to the right, never to the left, forever to the right. Let our creed be never to exceed regulated speed, no matter what the need. Come sing Hosanna, Hosanna, emblazoned on our banner is keep cool.
That's right. Peter, I said at the outset that a lot of critics consider 1776 to be one of the best books ever written for a musical. Do you think it's your best book? And could you sort of take us through the writing process, how you were able to build suspense for something that we know the outcome of?
Well, it's certainly, if not the best, it's certainly the longest book ever written.
That's why it's your favorite, right?
That's one of my favorite. I mean, there's the big scene in the Congress is 37 minutes, I think, without any musical interruption. And the end of the show is 18, 19 minutes without there's no music at all.
Not that bothersome music, right?
No, we like that. We book writers in the Association of Book Writers, none of whom has ever made, you must understand, the Musical Hall of Fame, the Theatrical Hall of Fame, in the lobby of the Gershwin Theater, where it would have served me right if I had to look at it every night. Everybody I've ever worked with, everybody.
Is there.
The sound men are there. The directors, everybody. No book writers ever made. So that's to my... It was a labor of inspiration as well as love, and I don't remember a lot about writing it, except that I was driven to do it,
Well,
I
whose,
looked.
whose idea
well,
was it? Yours or Sherman Edwards?
Sherman Edwards had the idea of doing this show, and he had written.
He was the composer.
He was the composer. He died several years ago, but this was his only work, and he was wonderful. He was a wonderful man, not unlike John Adams in many ways. He was very irascible. He was very outspoken. He didn't worry about niceties much, and he was very, very involved in this. And when I went in to hear the show, I didn't hold out. I mean, the idea appealed to me about as much as it appealed to anybody at that time. A show called 1776. I used to tell people, and they were asleep before I said six. It was not easy. But when I went in to hear the score, and he sat down at the piano, and played "Sit Down, John," "Sit Down, John," in a very raspy, not very interesting musical voice. The whole show became clear. And so everybody who came aboard, the director, the designers, the actors, all got the same sense. And when you're all doing the same show, it's going to work.
Yeah.
One of the great faults in doing shows is that you're not always, all the elements, all the collaborators, are not always doing the same, are on the same level, as Frank Lesser used to call it. And the level is a very important thing.
In other words, on the same wavelength, the same sort of working from the same playbook?
Yeah, it's a hard word to, yes, exactly. They're all really doing the same show. I've done shows where everybody was doing a different show. They didn't know that, and we sort of knew it, they didn't, but they were off doing something, and it never actually worked.
Was everybody doing the same show with Titanic?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. There are great similarities. Now, but let me answer your question let me answer the one question about the suspense. The thing that fascinates me most about theater, and it exists a great deal more than in film, because film commands believability, but the theater, because of its conventions, it's a very false place to start with. But there is a natural craving for storytelling in people, and especially for theater, having it acted out for them. And so every human being contains the ability to suspend disbelief. And the suspension of disbelief in the theater is an essential. And the audience, that's the contract. When they pay their money for a ticket, they have really paid for the opportunity to go in, sit down, and suspend their disbelief. Disbelief that there are people sitting next to them, disbelief that there are lights and there's makeup and there's scenery.
And the tickets are so high priced.
They're not highly priced. They're not. They're the same price in proportion to bread and telephones and chewing gum as they always were. Everything's gone up, and you're used to a time when you could. But the fact is, they are. I mean, movies are $9. Movies have gone up far more than than theater in that time. Anyway, what you have to do with suspension of disbelief is get out of their way. They want to do it. Don't stop them from doing it. And the same thing happens in Titanic. But the public is there for the suspense. Now, how do you create the suspense?
How did you?
Well, there are certain aids you give them. That's a bad word today. Certain assistance you give them to do that. For instance, I had to find out, when I had done film, one of the things in film that's really terrific is a clock running. As a matter of fact, even when it's not seen, a clock running is an expression. And I've done film where there was actually a digital clock that kept, taking a Pelham 1, 2, 3, we used it, and in other film I've done. So I put the calendar there.
Right.
Everybody knows July 4th, and you start tearing off pages, and you're getting closer and closer and closer to a date. On the other side of the stage is this tally board. It's a scorecard, and there's a scorecard of where you are. You need all 13 colonies unanimous for this to pass. There are only 7 there at the moment. You got 6 to get. You've got insurmountable problems, and as one by one, these shuttles cross from the Nay to the A column, and the leaves are falling off the calendar,
right.
And this thing creates it. So the audience wants it, and the same thing in Titanic. I hear when I go to see Titanic, and the engineer, the man who designed it, the architect, comes upstairs to the captain, up to the bridge, upstairs. You know, I'm filled with naval lingo. You know, they come upstairs to the room on top of the ship. Right? Anyway, you can tell I've been around boats all my life. Anyway, he comes upstairs, and the captain says, "How long has she got?" And he says, "We're sinking." Ismay, the owner, says God himself couldn't sink this ship. And he says, how, you know, and he says, Titanic is sinking, Mr. Ismay. And the audience, you hear sound. And then he says, how long have we got? And he says, an hour and a half, 2 most. And the audience, like, they walked in knowing it. They sit there knowing it. In fact, in the opening scene of Titanic, when the entire company walks up the gangplank, the audience is well aware that most, if not all of them, are going to be dead.
Which makes that opening scene so spectacular.
Exactly.
Really.
So at that point, you want to let them know that we know they know.
Right.
But later, we want them to go through the suspense of it. And they're more than willing to do it. They've come for that reason. That's why they come to theater, is to suspend that disbelief. And it's really important. And I'm an enormous advocate of that. I'm an advocate of I'm a slave to that concept.
We're a slave to our own time constraints here on the show, but I do want to touch on Titanic. In a rather insightful piece I wrote for the Daily News about how Titanic went through a very difficult preview period, turned itself around, and is now a big hit. You and I discussed your own personal experience going through that process, which I think you told me was something you'd never experienced in the theater before. Can you tell us a little bit about that and how difficult it was for you as the author of this troubled show to go from certain death to triumph?
Well, the one thing that was really unique for me was that it's my 14th or 15th show, depending how you count, and I'd always gone out of town with a musical, which is essential, and they don't go anymore. And what happens is you stay in town and you do all of your work, you appear in your underwear in front of everybody. And it's very bad, and the press, the daily press, with the exception only of you, I'm saying that quite seriously.
Oh, thank you.
We're very anxious that we failed, for a reason I can understand. They wanted this show called Titanic to be as big a disaster as the original, to make theater history, to make theater lore.
To make jokes about the title.
Yes, even you. No, you're a headline writer. It wasn't you. It was your headline
not
writer.
him.
All singing, all dancing, all drowning.
Right.
Oh,
That was
And
my
we
idea.
had
You know, the truth
They
comes
sing,
out.
they dance, they drown.
Exactly. Titanic hits an iceberg. Titanic won't sink, and they made up stories about our technical troubles, which we never had. We had our share of problems, but New York is a very, very. There is the theatrical community, for reasons I don't understand, and I love them all, come to the first preview they can get to in the hopes of seeing it in the worst condition it'll ever be in, and then running around telling everybody how bad it is.
Show queens on their tom-toms is the expression.
Well, it's everybody. They say, oh, guess what? I saw last night. You know, I was at the first preview, I guess it was Will Rogers, and a friend of mine, good friend of mine, walked in, and I said, what's wrong? You couldn't come last night? You know, it was the first preview. And he said, well, I have to go to the coast over the weekend. I said, we'll be here when you come back. You know, they have to see it, and they have to see it in the worst possible
Well, they want to see
condition.
it grow.
That's what they say, but they don't come back.
Oh.
I had somebody come to the first thing, and he said, I'm a student of the musical, and I keep coming back. And I saw him about a month after, and I said, you haven't come back yet, you know.
Yeah, right.
Oh, didn't I? No, I guess you're right. So it was unique to me, the amount of vitriol poured on the show and the amount of negativity, and it was just a show preparing for its opening. Every musical is in trouble out of town. Every musical. There's one only. It was Kiss Me Kate. They didn't change it. Every other show's in trouble. My Fair Lady was in trouble. Fiddler was in trouble. They were all, well, they were too long. They were in the wrong order. They did change an act. They're all in trouble. But you don't want to be here, where the trouble, first of all, in order to get a show out of trouble, you oftentimes have to tear it apart and put it back together again. So you'll put in a new second act, and the first act isn't even in agreement.
Right.
But you're in Philadelphia, you're in Boston, it doesn't matter. You can't do that. You don't do that. Somebody's agent might be there, some producer might be there. So you don't do your work, really. And so so for me, the most destructive thing was to be here during that period.
Mm-hmm. You had said to me, we just have a few seconds left, it was a roller coaster ride and you're not sure that it's over with yet. Have you settled into the fact that you do have a big hit on Broadway
I guess so. It was such a, we were so high, then brought so low, and then brought so high again, that it's very complicated. I've never had that happen to me. Yeah. And I guess it's in for a long haul. It's doing very, very well. We're selling, the theater's full every night. The lines are good. Our advance keeps growing.
All right.
And good night, Mr. and Mrs. America.
And we wish you luck with 1776. We'll be here to follow the story of whether or not it gets to Broadway.
So will I.
Peter, it's always a pleasure. Thanks for being our guest.
Thanks to the two of you.
A great pleasure. And now I can never get enough of it. Godspeed, Titanic.
We welcome your questions or comments for Theater Talk. Thank you and good night.